Hello, everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. My name is John, an ordinary man living in a small apartment in the suburbs. My job is quite busy, and I often have to return home very late at night. That is also the reason why I decided to install a security camera in the living room and bedroom. At first, the intention was very simple. I just wanted to feel more secure when living alone. The neighborhood I live in is not too dangerous, but in the past few weeks there have been a few break-ins that made me worried. The first day when the camera was activated, I felt a strange sense of security. I went to bed and thought that everything was under control. But that night, everything started to change. When I woke up in the morning, I made a cup of coffee and opened my phone to review the recording. I just wanted to check if everything was working properly. The video was quite normal at first. I saw myself walking into the bedroom, turning off the lights and lying down on the bed. But when the clock pointed to about 3 a.m., I saw a detail that made my blood stop. There was a figure standing right next to my bed. That person didn't move, just stood there silently staring at me. I strained my eyes to look at the screen again, thinking that maybe the camera was faulty, but the image was too clear. A tall, thin figure was hidden in the darkness, but the facial features were exactly like mine. A cold feeling spread across my back. I wondered if I was dreaming or if my mind was deceiving me. But the camera doesn't lie. I continued to rewind the tape many times, and the truth didn't change. That figure stood next to my bed for nearly half an hour, then disappeared into thin air. There was no sound of the door opening, no footsteps going out. It simply disappeared. From that moment on, the familiar apartment suddenly became a strange, cold, and dangerous place. That night, I didn't dare to sleep. I sat in the brightly lit living room, my eyes glued to the phone screen. At nearly 3 a.m., I saw that figure appear again. This time, he was standing right at the living room door. Again, the face was exactly like mine, except for the eyes were blank and unblinking. I sat there motionless, my heart pounding, wondering if this was some cruel joke someone was playing. But my apartment was locked. All the windows were closed. There was no way anyone could have sneaked in. The next day, I called a friend named Mark to tell him the story. He laughed, thinking I was just nervous. He said it was probably a reflection of the light that was creating an illusion. I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't an illusion. I decided to install another camera right in the corner opposite my bed. I wanted to make sure I had clear evidence next time. The second night passed and I braced myself. I lay down, but inside I was filled with fear. At exactly 3 a.m., the scary image appeared again, but this time I got two different angles. The shadow standing next to my bed still had the same face as me, but from the second angle, I could clearly see that the figure was leaning down close to my face and staring at me while I was sleeping. My throat tightened and my hands trembled as I rewinded the tape. I felt like I had just watched a vivid horror movie with myself as the main character. I knew I needed to find an explanation. I searched the internet for strange camera recordings. Some called it a doppelganger, an evil human replica that often appeared to signal bad luck. Some said it was a haunting ghost, and some believed it was a spiritual disturbance. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer safe in my own home. The fear grew. I started to hear small sounds at night. A light tap on the window, footsteps in the hallway. When I woke up to check, Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. I became insomniac and my body was tired, but I did not dare to turn off the camera for a second. The more I looked, the more certain I was that there was an entity teasing me. The third night, I decided to pretend to sleep to observe. I lay still with my eyes closed, but my heart was tense. At exactly 3 a.m., a slight buzzing sound from the camera sounded, and I knew he had come again. I opened my eyes slightly and looked towards the door. A tall, thin figure quietly walked in and stopped right next to the bed. A cold feeling spread throughout the room, as if the air had been sucked out. I held my breath, kept quiet, and listened to my heartbeat. When he leaned down close to my face, I clearly saw the empty black eyes and the faint, distorted smile. He looked like me, but not completely, like a distorted copy that only existed to spread terror. I wanted to scream and jump up, but my whole body was stiff and unable to move. Only when he disappeared did I suddenly wake up, panting and drenched in sweat. Asterisk, from that day on, I didn't dare to sleep anymore. I realized that I was living in a never-ending nightmare. The camera that I thought would protect me now became a door that opened to a terrifying reality that I never wanted to enter. And that was just the beginning of a series of horror stories that awaited me in the following nights. After that terrible night, I was no longer myself. Every time I saw the small camera in the corner of the room, I felt my stomach tighten. It was no longer a protection device, but a door opening to a world full of ghosts. I knew for sure that something unusual was happening in this apartment, and I knew my story had gone beyond the normal imagination. These were no longer bad dreams, but ghost stories coming to life in my life. The next day, I went to work with a haggard face. My colleagues asked me why I looked like I hadn't slept for many nights. I just laughed and said I was under pressure from work. How could I tell them about the presence of an invisible double in my bedroom? I was afraid they would think I was crazy, but the fear could not be hidden. At night, I returned to the apartment and felt like I was walking into a trap. I decided to call Mark. I told him I wanted him to see the footage with his own eyes. When he arrived, I opened my laptop to show him the footage from last night. His eyes were initially full of sarcasm, but then slowly turned to confusion. He rewinded the scene of the figure standing next to my bed. He looked at me and was silent for a long time. I asked him what he thought. He just answered briefly, maybe the camera was broken. But I knew there was something else in his eyes. He was also afraid. That night, I begged him to stay with me. We sat in the living room with the lights on, staring at the phone screen. Time passed slowly. When the clock jumped to 3 a.m., I felt a chill run down my spine. The camera started to show the image of a figure standing in the hallway. Mark looked at me and swallowed. The face that looked exactly like mine was staring straight into the camera, its black eyes empty. Suddenly, the figure disappeared after only a few seconds. Mark jumped up and walked around the house, checking every window and every lock. Everything was intact, no sign of intrusion. He turned to look at me and said in a trembling voice, "John, I don't know what the hell this is, but I'm not sleeping here another night." He packed up and left, leaving me to my haunting. When I was alone, I started to hear strange whispering sounds. It was like someone was standing right next to my ear saying nonsense. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The room was empty and cold. I shivered and tried to reassure myself that it was just stress. But then the camera caught things that my eyes couldn't see. I rewound the tape of that night and found myself sleeping. But right next to the bed were two figures. One was a distorted copy of me with empty eyes. The other was a faint shadow, like a female ghost with long hair covering her face. Both stood silently watching me sleep. The sight made my blood run cold. There was no doubt that these were real ghost stories. There was an invisible force following me. The next day, I went to a priest in town. I told him the whole story. He listened carefully and then advised me to leave the apartment for a while. He said it might be haunted. I nodded but knew I couldn't leave it all behind, so I had lived here for years, and it was the only place I could call home. But every night, I found myself trapped in a dark box with uninvited spirits. The next night, I decided to try something different. I left my laptop open and placed it in front of me as I lay in bed. I wanted to see if anything happened. Around 3 a.m., the laptop screen flashed and I saw a figure walk in. But this time, I didn't just see it through the camera. I heard heavy footsteps in the room. The air was thick and cold. I could feel his breath right on my cheek. I shivered and pulled the covers over my face. When I opened my eyes, the laptop screen was black. But for a brief moment, I saw the silhouette of a female ghost standing at the end of the bed. Her hair fell down, her white eyes staring straight at me. I jumped up and screamed, but there was no one in the apartment. The camera recorded everything, but when I reviewed it in the morning, the tape was blank. As if the camera had been manipulated too. This truth was even more terrifying than I thought. There was not only one clone, but many other entities lurking around me. This apartment had now become a maze of ghosts. I knew clearly that I could no longer control anything. The ghost stories I had heard from others were now becoming a reality in my life, and I understood that this was only the beginning. After reviewing the empty footage, I knew the camera was no longer on my side. It was like a blind eye that only showed me what the entities wanted me to see. I began to live in a constant state of tension. Every night, the apartment turned into a maze where the slightest noise would startle me. The haunted stories were no longer someone else's strange story, but were clinging to me. Every minute and every hour. The next night, I tried sleeping in the living room instead of the bedroom. I turned on the lights and placed my laptop right in front of me to monitor the camera in the bedroom. I hoped that if anything happened, it would be confined to those four walls. But around 2:50, I heard a knock on the living room door. 3 slow knocks echoed in the quiet space. I swallowed and went to the door. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty and there was no one. I closed the door and locked it. But only a few minutes later, the knocking rang out again. This time I didn't open the door, but stared at the camera screen. A faint black shadow appeared in the bedroom, standing right in the middle of the room. It didn't move, just stood there looking at the camera. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to explode. I wanted to run away from the apartment, but my legs seemed to be glued to the floor. I sat motionless until the shadow slowly dissipated like smoke. The next day, I tried to find an explanation. I went online to search for information about the apartment I was living in. I discovered that there had been a fire in this building many years ago. 3 people died in the apartment below me. A small family, a husband, wife, and their daughter. They were trapped in the fire and no one could save them. It was rumored that their souls were still lingering in the building. When I read that line, my back turned cold. Perhaps what I saw was not just a doppelganger, but also the ghosts who died unjustly in the fire years ago. That night, I decided to test it. I placed a chair in the bedroom and sat staring at the live camera. When the clock struck 3 o'clock, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The bedroom door opened slightly and a cold wind blew in. On the screen, I saw the shadow of a little girl walking in. Her hair was scorched and her clothes were stained with black smoke. She looked straight at me, sitting in the living room through the camera, and smiled. That smile made my hair stand on end. I knew I was no longer dreaming. These were real ghosts haunting this apartment. The feeling of being surrounded became more and more obvious. I started to hear whispers every time I turned off the lights. When I went to take a shower, I saw the shadow of a woman standing behind a steamy mirror. When I turned back, there was no one, but the steam on the mirror clearly showed the shape of a wet hand. Every corner of the apartment became a hiding place for spirits. I lived in fear to the point of not daring to sleep. Mark tried to call me several times, but I didn't answer. I was afraid he wouldn't believe me or think I was crazy, but the reality was scarier than any story. I was living in a truly haunted apartment. The haunted stories from books and movies were now playing out before my eyes every day, and I knew it was just the beginning. The next night, I tried to pray. I knelt in front of my bed, clasped my hands, and recited the prayers that the priest had taught me. As I recited, I heard a whisper in response. A man's voice was hoarse right behind me. I turned around in shock but saw only cold emptiness. However, the camera had recorded the silhouette of a man standing close behind me. His eyes were black and his face was covered in ash. When I watched it again the next morning, I almost collapsed. I knew my every move was being watched. There was no moment of peace. I tried to leave the apartment, but every time I reached the door, I felt like someone was holding me back. The hallway lights flickered on and off. I could hear the echoes of children's laughter. It seemed like the entire building belonged to them. I was just trapped with no way out. I wasn't sure how much longer I could survive. When I returned to my room, I saw clear marks on the bed. The pillows and blankets were askew, as if someone had just been lying there. I shivered as I approached and saw a streak of black ash on the bedsheet. It was cold and crumbling to the touch. I knew that these spirits were not just appearing on camera, but actually touching my world. I knew that I was being haunted, and my haunted stories would continue for the next few nights. I can't remember the last time I slept through the night. My body is tired, but my mind won't let me close my eyes. Every time darkness falls over the apartment, my heart constricts as if waiting for a death sentence. The camera is still there, a cold eye watching every corner of the house. I know that once midnight passes, it will record the things I never want to see. This is no longer a coincidence, but a vicious cycle that repeats itself over and over again. Tonight, I tried taking sleeping pills, hoping to fall into a deep sleep without being haunted. But the pills only made my body heavy, while my mind remained awake. I lay on the bed, looking at the small red light flashing from the camera, and felt like I was being watched by dozens of invisible eyes. Around 3 a.m., when I was feeling sleepy, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Then a small laugh sounded like a child's laughter. I jumped up, my heart pounding. The laptop screen lit up, displaying the image from the camera. The silhouette of the little girl with burnt hair appeared again. She sat right in the middle of the bedroom floor and started playing with the ashes like she was playing with a toy. I was stunned by the scene. Suddenly, she raised her head. Her eyes were white, looking straight into the camera and smiling. I quickly closed the laptop, but the giggling sound still echoed throughout the room. I realized that even when the device was turned off, those ghosts were still here. The next day, I didn't have enough energy to go to the company. I sat on the floor in the living room, my mind spinning. I heard whispers as if someone was standing right behind me, calling my name. When I returned, the room was still empty. I began to doubt whether I was still sane or not. But every time I watched the tape again, I knew for sure that I wasn't imagining things. Every image and every sound was clear evidence that this apartment was heavily haunted. That night, I tried placing salt around the bed and hanging a cross, as the priest had advised. I prayed and sat waiting. 3 a.m. came again, and the room was filled with an unusual cold. The camera showed a tall man standing outside the door. He didn't enter, he just stood there staring. But then suddenly the door opened and a cold wind blew out the candle I had placed on the table. The screen shook and the figure disappeared. I almost fainted from fear. The following days things got worse. I started to see shadows moving even when it was still light. In the bathroom mirror, I saw someone standing behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I heard footsteps running on the ceiling, as if someone was living right above me. But my apartment was on the top floor. I realized I was stuck in a vicious cycle with no way out. The scary stories I had heard from others now came to life in my every moment. One night, I decided to try to face it. I left the camera recording while I sat in the middle of my bedroom. I held the old Bible in my hand, trembling as I waited. At the usual time, the room suddenly became cold. The screen showed a woman with long hair and a veil. She approached me step by step. I trembled as I recited the prayers, but my voice was broken. She stopped right next to the bed and bent down close to my face. I felt her cold breath and the strong smell of smoke. At that moment, I was sure I was going to die. But then she disappeared, leaving a silent void. I sat motionless all night. When the sky brightened, I saw a purple bruise on my neck, as if a hand was squeezing it. I understood that I was not only haunted mentally, but also physically. This apartment was no longer a shelter, but a trap. I started to think about leaving, but every time I packed my things, I heard knocking on the door, whispering, forcing me to stay. I was like a prey being hunted in my own home. Mark called again, but I didn't answer. I didn't want to drag him into this nightmare. I knew I had to face it and find a way out. But as the days went by, I felt myself getting weaker, losing sleep and my energy draining. The scary stories were no longer stories to tell others, but nightmares that were eating away at my soul day by day. The next night, I heard the sound of chairs being dragged in the kitchen. When I ran to check, everything was still in place. But the camera recorded the scene where all the chairs automatically moved in a circle in the middle of the kitchen. When I watched that scene again, I felt my blood freeze. I knew that the things that were with me in this apartment had no intention of letting go. I could only continue recording and pray to find a way out before it was too late. I began to realize that the apartment was no longer the place I knew. Every corner, every door held a cold secret. I tried to reassure myself that everything would be fine once the light was turned on. But the terrible thing was that they didn't disappear when the sun came up. They were still there, silently clinging to me. Every day that passed, the apartment became more cramped. Not because of the furniture, but because of the invisible, creepy shadows that crept throughout the space. One morning, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I suddenly felt someone standing behind me. I glanced quickly at the mirror and almost dropped my toothbrush. In the mirror, there was not only me, but another face right behind me. It was my face, but it was distorted, as if someone had stretched it. The eyes were empty, and the mouth had a strange smile. I turned around, but there was no one behind me. When I looked back in the mirror, the image had disappeared, but in this steam, there was still a clear handprint. I trembled and stepped back, feeling my stomach twist. That night, I tried not to look in the mirror. I turned off all the bathroom lights and closed the door tightly. But as I walked past, I heard whispering coming from inside. Some disjointed sounds, like someone was calling my name. I pressed my ear to the door and listened, and my heart stopped when I heard the giggles of a child. I hurried back to the living room, but the sound still echoed in my head. That night, I tried lying on the sofa and turned on some music to drown out the noise. But the camera caught an image that almost made me faint. In the video, a tall, thin man emerged from the wall behind me. He stood there watching me sleep, then slowly disappeared. I rewinded the tape over and over again, and every time I watched it, my skin crawled. I knew I was not alone. The next day I tried cleaning the apartment, hoping to find something unusual. When I pulled the wardrobe away from the wall, I discovered a patchy black burn mark. It looked like a deep fire mark from many years ago, when I touched the falling ashes that covered my hands. I suddenly heard a sharp breath right behind my neck. I turned around, but there was no one, yet the breath was still lingering. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding. I tried calling Mark again, but he didn't pick up. I knew he didn't want to get involved anymore. I was left alone with this nightmare. The apartment was now like a door to another world. Whenever I looked into the camera or mirror, I could see them. They wanted me to know that they existed, and they were getting bolder and bolder. Another night, I was sitting in front of my laptop when the screen suddenly went haywire. The image jumped around and stopped at a scene that didn't belong in my apartment. It was an empty room with cracked walls and yellow light. In the middle of the room was an old wooden chair. On the chair sat a motionless figure. When the image cleared, I was stunned to realize it was me again. But this version looked withered and gaunt like a corpse. I panicked and turned off the computer, but I knew it wasn't an illusion. I felt my body getting weaker day by day. I lost weight rapidly. My eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. I heard scratching sounds in the walls at night. Footsteps ran around the ceiling and then disappeared. I felt like my strength was being drained by the hour. Those creepy entities were feeding on my fear. I began to wonder how many more nights I could survive. Every time 3 a.m. came, I heard a slow knock on the door. 3 echoes made my skin crawl. I didn't dare to open it anymore, just sat shivering in the corner of the house. But the worst thing was, when I didn't hear the knock, I became more worried, because then I knew they were standing somewhere in the apartment waiting to appear suddenly, exhausted. I fell asleep on the sofa. When I woke up, I was no longer in the living room, but on the bedroom floor. The camera recorded me walking into it with my eyes closed. Behind me was a tall, thin figure with a creepy smile. I had no memory of moving, but my body was covered in bruises as if someone was pulling me. I knew I was losing control. The apartment was no longer a place to live, but a living trap. I was trapped in a game of invisible entities. They wouldn't let me rest, wouldn't give me hope. They turned my nights into a series of horrors that I couldn't escape. Those creepy images now haunted every breath, every moment of my life, and I knew the coming nights would be even more terrifying. After many sleepless nights, I decided to have clear evidence to convince myself that I was not crazy. I installed 2 more cameras, one in the kitchen and one in the hallway outside the main door. I wanted to cover the entire apartment. When the cameras were on simultaneously, I felt like I was creating a net to catch whatever was haunting me. But at the same time, I was afraid that what I was about to see would be too much to bear. That night, I lay on the sofa, pretending to sleep to monitor. The laptop connected directly to me so I could see all 4 screens at the same time. At about 2:58, the kitchen screen started to flicker. I zoomed in and saw the chair automatically pull away from the table as if someone had sat down, but the chair remained empty. Then a glass fell to the floor and shattered. I could hear the noise clearly even in the living room. I looked around the apartment. It was completely silent, but the cameras recorded the truth clearly. When the clock pointed to 3 a.m., I switched to the bedroom camera. I was stunned to see myself lying on the bed, sleeping, but I knew I was sitting on the sofa. The image on the screen was another version of me. The person was breathing steadily, eyes closed, and looked exactly like I was dreaming. I felt sweat dripping down my palms. If it wasn't me, then who was it? I quickly rewinded the video from the beginning and realized that the other version had appeared around midnight. There was no scene of him entering. He simply lay there as if he had always been in the apartment. I took my phone and recorded the laptop screen as a second proof. I knew that these were real scary stories. No one could make this up. The next day, I brought the video to an old colleague who used to work in the technology field. I asked him to check if the camera had been hacked. He looked at each frame and shook his head. The system showed no signs of intrusion. He said that these recordings were completely original and unedited. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He only said to me one sentence: "John, maybe you should move somewhere else." But I couldn't leave easy. I felt like these entities would follow me wherever I went. The evidence was growing, but I felt more and more alone. I sent the video to Mark, but he refused to see it. He said he didn't want to get involved anymore. I understood him, but I also felt abandoned in the nightmare. The next night, I tried setting the camera to infrared mode. I wanted to see clearly what was in the dark. The result was worse than I expected. On the screen appeared a series of white shadows moving around the room. They moved silently, as if they had been living in the apartment for a long time. There was the shadow of a woman with long hair leaning close to my face when I pretended to sleep. There was the shadow of a child playing on the floor. And in the corner of the room was a tall, thin shadow with glowing eyes. I replayed the scene over and over again, but it was the same scene. I knew I couldn't continue living like this. But when I tried to turn off all the cameras to sleep, the fear was even more terrible. I felt them standing right next to me without seeing them through the screen. I even heard footsteps approaching the bed and breathing in my ear. I immediately got up and turned the camera back on, and sure enough, the tall, thin figure was standing next to the bed. If it weren't for that device, I wouldn't even know what was going on in the following days. I posted the video on an online forum. I hoped to find someone who had experienced the same thing. Many people commented that I was just making a movie to get views. But there were also people who said they believed because they had experienced the same thing. One person said that his home camera had recorded a ghost standing next to his child's crib. Reading those words, I felt both comforted and scared. Comforted because I wasn't crazy, but scared because I wasn't the only one. My body was getting more and more exhausted. I lived in a state of obsession, and there was a lot of evidence, but I couldn't do anything to stop it. I knew I was becoming part of the true scary stories that people would pass on to each other. My story was no longer a video on the internet, but a testament to the existence of a dark world parallel to ours. I tried to pack up to leave on a weekend night. But when I opened the door, I saw a dark hallway without a single light. The hallway camera showed a series of white figures standing close together along both walls. They stared at me motionless. I was scared and closed the door and sat down on the floor. I knew I had no way out. These entities had decided that I belonged here. I looked back at all the videos again and suddenly realized the most terrible thing. In every scene, no matter which room, the tall, thin figure with bright eyes was always standing somewhere in the frame. He watched me without leaving for a second, and I knew that he was the one leading everything. I didn't know how long I could hold on, but my story certainly didn't end there. This is the truth and living proof of the most terrifying, true, scary stories. I began to understand that my apartment was no longer simply a shelter. It was like a locked box where wandering souls gathered and turned into a real haunted house. I lived in fear every hour. Every time I entered the living room, I felt like dozens of invisible eyes were watching me. The haunted stories that I once considered fictional were now clearly present in every breath. One tired night, I fell asleep on the sofa. When I opened my eyes, I saw the ceiling covered with black stains like burning smoke. At that moment, I heard a continuous knocking sound coming from the wall as if someone was trapped on the other side. I tried to ignore it, but the sound got louder. I turned on the camera and the image that appeared made my hair stand on end. A charred arm came out from the wall, scratching hard, leaving long scratches. I screamed, but then the arm disappeared, leaving only deep black burn marks. I decided not to sleep anymore and sat and watched until morning. At 3 a.m., the room was filled with an unusual cold breeze. The camera recorded the silhouette of a long-haired woman appearing in the corner of the kitchen. She walked down slowly and turned her head to look straight into the lens. Her white eyes lit up the screen. I sat there, frozen, not daring to move. When I replayed the tape in the morning, I saw clearly the details of her ashen face, as if she had just stepped out of a fire. I went to the building manager to ask about the history of this place. He was initially evasive, but finally confessed. This building had been the scene of a terrible fire many years ago. Many residents had died in the apartment. It was rumored that their souls had never left. Hearing this, I understood more clearly what I was facing. I was not just seeing a ghost, I was living in a cursed house. The following days, the phenomenon became more intense. Lights flickered continuously. Doors opened and closed by themselves. Footsteps echoed down the hallway in the middle of the night. I started to see shadows in the window glass, but when I turned around, no one was there. One time, I heard someone whispering my name right next to my ear. When I turned around, I saw the faint outline of a little girl with a creepy smile. I knew I was surrounded by spirits another night. While sitting in the living room, I heard the sound of a piano playing from the apartment next door. But the apartment had long since been abandoned after the fire. The gloomy music echoed throughout the night. When I checked in the morning, I found that the apartment next door had no musical instruments. There were only black ash stains covering the floor. I felt like I was stepping deeper into the cursed land. My body was getting weaker and weaker. I hardly ate or slept. Every time I dozed off, I dreamed that I was locked in a room filled with smoke and fire. In the dream, I ran but could not escape. When I woke up, My body was drenched in sweat and there were scratches on my arms. I realized that the boundary between dream and reality was fading. The spirits were not only present in the camera, but also touched me. I tried to find a way to leave, but there was an invisible force holding me. When I opened the door to the hallway, I saw a series of charred figures standing motionless on both sides. They did not move, but their soulless eyes were directed straight at me. I panicked and closed the door. I understood that I had no way out. This house had locked me in endless haunted stories. One night, I turned on all the cameras and left the lights on. I sat in the middle of the room holding a Bible. Around 3 a.m., the lights went out all at once and the apartment was plunged into absolute darkness. The camera screen kept flashing, showing a series of ghosts crowded in the apartment. I shouted out a prayer, but my voice was trembling and lost. When I turned the lights back on, the room was empty, but on the floor were black ash footprints leading from the window to right next to me. I knew clearly that this haunting was no longer a warning. It was turning me into a part of it. This house did not want to let me go. I am no longer the master, but the captive. The haunted stories I am living will continue to torment me until I completely belong to this place. My apartment was no longer a shelter, but a living scene for a long nightmare. As the days passed, I lived in a state of half awake and half asleep. I knew I could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion. But one thing was certain: what the cameras recorded was undeniable. I was living in a terrifying, true horror story, and every frame was a proof. One night, I turned on all the cameras at the same time and sat waiting. The laptop displayed 4 screens simultaneously. At first, it was just deathly silence. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., the bedroom screen showed me sleeping. I was stunned because I was sitting in the living room at that time. Once again, my horror double appeared and lay motionless on the bed. I trembled as I zoomed in and realized that his face was cracked as if burned by fire. His eyes were wide open and unblinking, staring straight into the camera. I screamed but could not stop the scene. On another screen, I saw the kitchen, a silhouette of a long-haired woman. She stood in front of the refrigerator and slowly turned her head to look at the camera. As her face became clear, I saw pieces of charred skin fall to the floor in ashes. A buzzing sound echoed throughout the laptop, as if the spirits themselves were trying to convey a message. I closed the laptop, but the whispering still echoed in the room. I began to write down everything that happened. I wrote down the exact date and time along with the video. I hoped to show it to someone later to prove it. But the more I wrote, the more I felt like an unwilling witness in an invisible court. I knew that this apartment was not only haunted, but a place where souls were held, a prison of ghosts who had died unjustly. One morning when I woke up, I found an old piece of paper on the table. On it were scrawled the words, "Leave while you still can." I had never put the paper there. I checked the camera, but the tape had been lost for 2 hours during the night. Nothing showed up. I knew one of the entities was trying to send me a message. But why? Were they trying to warn me or trap me deeper? My body was slowly wasting away. I was losing weight rapidly and my eyes were dark. I no longer felt hungry. Instead, a constant fear ate away at my mind. I tried to leave the apartment several times, but was always met with phenomena that prevented me. Once, when I opened the door, I saw the hallway was pitch black. The hallway camera showed dozens of white figures standing close together. I didn't dare to step through. Another time, when I was packing up, I heard footsteps running round the house, and all the windows opened at the same time, even though I had locked them. One night, I tried to confront it directly. I placed the camera right next to my bed and lay down pretending to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I felt the air in the room become thick. I opened my eyes slightly and saw a tall, thin figure standing right next to me. He leaned down close to my face. His empty eyes looked straight at me, and his crooked lips curved into a smile. I tried to stay calm, but my whole body stiffened. When the camera captured that moment, I knew I had clear evidence. This was no longer a hallucination. This was real. The next day, I posted this video on a large forum. Thousands of views and comments appeared. Some people called me a fabricator, but many said they believed because they had experienced similar phenomena. One person shared that his house had been haunted for many years after a fire. Reading those lines, I felt both comforted and desperate. Comforted because I was not alone, but desperate because I knew that no one could really help me. The next night, things got worse. The cameras showed conflicting images. In the living room, I saw myself sitting on the sofa, but at the same time, I was walking in the hallway. In the bedroom, a burned version of me was still lying on the bed. I was confused because I no longer knew where I really was. The apartment had become a maze of versions and ghosts. I lost control of myself. I began to hear the knocking on the door every night. When I didn't open the door, I heard whispers from outside. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But the camera clearly showed the silhouettes of a family of 3 standing in front of the door. They were burned all over. Their eyes were lifeless. I understood that this was the family that died in the fire years ago. They came to me not to harm me, but perhaps to drag me into it. This apartment was no longer a place to live, but a living testament to a true horror story. I knew clearly that I was just a prey being hunted. Every night that passed, I was closer to the abyss. And I also knew that this story would not end until I completely belonged to them. I gradually realized that this apartment was more than just haunted. It was like a machine that produced endless horror stories. Each night, there was a new detail that made me lose control. I lived in a never-ending chain of creepy stories. One night while sitting in the living room, I heard a childish laughter echoing from the bedroom. My heart was pounding. When I turned on the camera screen, I saw the charred little girl sitting in the middle of my bed. Her back was to the camera and she was singing a distorted tune. I felt my blood run cold. When she turned her head, her white eyes stared straight into the lens. Her mouth was in a wide smile. I quickly turned off the screen, but the singing continued in my ears for several minutes. The next day, I discovered something even more terrifying. When I watched the video again, I saw myself walking into the bedroom and sitting down next to the little girl. That version of me talked to her as if they had known each other for a long time. I don't remember doing that. As I rewinded the video, I could clearly see the other version and the child looking at the camera and smiling. I felt nauseous and almost crazy. I tried to draw a map of the apartment to find the source. I found that the bedroom was where the phenomenon occurred most. The walls had scorch marks that never disappeared. That night, I set all the cameras to point at the bed. At exactly 3 a.m., the bed started shaking violently. The sheets were pulled off and black handprints were clearly visible on the mattress. I watched, my whole body numb. The camera recording that scene made me sure that the apartment was being taken over by a force. My body was getting worse and worse. I was constantly sleep deprived and in a state of extreme stress. When I looked in the mirror, I saw myself smiling while my lips were not moving. The reflection looked at me with empty eyes and chuckled softly. I smashed the mirror in panic, but in each piece of broken glass, I still saw dozens of eyes looking back. Mark called me again, but I didn't answer. I didn't want to drag him back into this hell. I felt like I was separated from the real world. Everyone out there lived normally, while I was trapped in an apartment where every corner of the wall was a creepy story. One night while watching the camera, I suddenly heard the sound of running water from the bathroom. When I entered, I saw the bathtub filled with black water that smelled of burning. I knew clearly that I had never turned on the faucet. On the surface of the water was the reflection of a man with glowing eyes. He gradually rose from the water and approached me. I panicked and rushed out of the room and locked the door. When I returned, the bathtub was dry as if it had never been there. But the camera clearly recorded the black figure rising and disappearing into the air. Creepy stories followed one after another, turning me into a prisoner in my own life. I no longer knew what to believe. All I know for sure is that this apartment doesn't want to let me go. It wants me to be a part of it, like all the other souls. And every day that passes brings me closer to that fate. I realized that there were moments that lasted only a few seconds, but were enough to make my heart stop. Each time the camera flashed, it revealed a horrifying scene and then disappeared as quickly as if it had never existed. These short, scary stories were short, but more haunting than anything that lasted. One night, while watching the screen, I saw the shadow of a tall, thin man passing through the hallway. In just a split second, he disappeared. But when I slowed down, I saw him turn and look straight into the lens. His eyes were glowing like hot coals. I trembled, knowing that he had recognized me. From then on, every time I looked at the camera, I was always worried about when he would appear. Another time, when I walked past the bathroom, I only glanced at the mirror for less than a second. But in that moment, I saw the entire room behind me filled with people. Dozens of ghosts stood close together, staring out. When I turned around, there was only cold emptiness. I almost collapsed because I knew that this apartment was not just filled with a few souls, but an invisible crowd. One morning, I woke up to find 3 long scratches on my neck. I couldn't remember what I did to cause them. I turned on the camera, and in a flash, I saw a black hand coming out of the wall and scratching my neck while I was sleeping. The image disappeared after a second, but the wound was still there. I knew the evidence was too obvious. The more I observed, the more I saw such moments clearly. One night, I was sitting writing in my diary when the lights flickered. In that moment, I saw the shadow of a long-haired woman standing right behind me through the glass window. When the lights came back on, she was gone, but the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. I gasped, realizing they were not only on camera, but right next to me. Another time, I was walking down the hallway and caught a glimpse of the bedroom door slightly open. In the darkness inside, a pair of bright eyes were staring out. I turned around, but the door was closed. I was no longer sure what was an illusion and what was reality. Every brief moment turned into a terrifying story that was deeply engraved in my mind. I tried turning off all the cameras one night to avoid witnessing it, but that only made things worse. In the darkness, I could clearly hear footsteps circling around my bed. Sometimes I saw a dark shadow gliding across the light from the window. Everything happened so fast that I couldn't react. I realized I couldn't escape by closing my eyes. These phenomena would continue whether I looked or not. I started to feel like time was passing strangely. There were blank memories, as if they were cut off. When I reviewed the cameras, I saw myself moving around the apartment while I was sleeping. One time I went into the kitchen, holding a knife, standing still for hours, then returning to bed. I couldn't remember anything. The video was only a few minutes long, but it haunted me for a lifetime. I knew I was losing control. The short, scary stories kept overwhelming me, exhausting my mind. It doesn't have to last all night. Just a few seconds is enough for me to never forget. Every blink is a new nightmare, and I'm sure those moments will get more and more intense until I completely lose my sense of who I am. I began to understand that the phenomena occurring in the apartment went beyond the realm of ordinary ghosts. This was not just the haunting of trapped souls. I was dealing with something more supernatural. These paranormal stories made me no longer believe in the distinction between the living world and the dead world. One night, while sitting in the living room, I felt the atmosphere suddenly change. The temperature dropped dramatically and the lights flickered. The cameras simultaneously recorded dim lights hovering in the room. They moved around like disembodied souls. I sat there, dumbfounded, watching the scene. When I played back, I clearly saw that the lights drew a circle on the ceiling. I didn't know if it was a signal or a ritual, but its presence made me shiver. The next day, I tried to learn about this phenomenon online. Some people called it an orb, a sign that the soul was active. Others said it was proof of a door to the other world. I read for hours, but could not find a satisfactory answer. The more I researched, the more I felt myself drawn into a spiral with no way out. The next night, things got even more terrifying. While I was watching the screen, I saw an invisible door open in the middle of the living room. The camera showed a dark frame like a deep hole. From it emerged vague figures. They entered the apartment and disappeared in just a few seconds. I was stunned to realize that my apartment had become a door to the other world. I knew I was not just being haunted, but living in the center of a much larger supernatural phenomenon. One morning, I woke up to find all the furniture moved. Tables and chairs were turned sideways, windows were open, and there were strange symbols on the walls that looked like carvings. I was sure I had not done it. The camera lost data between midnight and dawn. I knew that those entities had directly impacted the physical world. This was beyond any logical explanation. I tried recording the night air. When I played it back, I heard dozens of voices whispering in an unfamiliar language. Some of the sounds sounded like a child sobbing, some like a woman's laughter. I listened for hours and felt like my mind was being ripped apart. The voices made me certain that there was a force communicating with me, but I couldn't understand the message. The next night, I had a strange dream. I found myself walking into a room filled with smoke and fire. In the middle of the room was a family of 3, trapped. They looked at me with desperate eyes. When I tried to run to save them, the fire flared up and they turned to ashes. When I woke up, I could still hear their screams echoing in my ears. I understood that dreams were not created by the mind, but were a communication from the other world. I began to question whether I was the only one who saw it all. Maybe I had become a link in a chain of paranormal stories that lasted for decades. This apartment is not just haunted by a few ghosts, but a meeting point where lost souls gather. I fear that once this door is opened, it will never close again. As I sat in the dark, I heard the sound of chains dragging in the distance. The heavy sound echoed throughout the apartment. When I turned on the camera, I saw a giant black figure shuffling around the living room. He was so tall that his head almost touched the ceiling. His eyes glowed in the darkness. He walked slowly as if searching. When I looked straight into the lens, I felt like he was looking at me through the camera. I turned off the camera in panic, but the sound of chains still lingered in my ears. I knew clearly that things had gone beyond my ability to bear. This was no longer a normal apartment. It was a meeting point between two worlds. I had no control over anything. I could only wait for each night to pass and witness more paranormal stories that I never thought would exist in real life. I was used to the camera recording scary scenes, but that night it was even scarier. When I opened my laptop to review the video, I realized that the image on the screen was not just playing back. It was moving in its own way, as if the video had come to life. The animated horror stories began from that moment. In the bedroom recording, I saw myself lying on the bed. But when I slowed down, I realized that my eyes in the video were open and looking straight at the camera. The scary thing was that at that moment, I was sure that I was sleeping soundly. The version in the screen blinked, smiled faintly, and sat up. I backed away from the laptop, my heart pounding. The video was no longer a static recording. It had become something more alive than reality. I tried to turn off the laptop, but the screen was still on. The version in the video stood up and walked out of the frame. I was stunned when I saw him appear on the other camera screen in the living room. He moved as if he were living in a parallel apartment. I felt like I was watching a horror movie, but I was the main actor. The next day, I almost didn't dare to open the device. But curiosity forced me to check. This time, the camera recorded the scene in the kitchen. I saw the silhouette of a long-haired woman standing still. After a few seconds, she slowly turned her head. But instead of just looking at the lens, she reached out and touched the screen. A clear handprint appeared on the laptop's glass surface. I panicked and closed the device, but the handprint was still there, making me shiver. The videos became more and more bizarre. One time, I saw myself in the video sitting in front of the laptop like I was now. But the image in the video moved differently from me. He raised his head and looked straight out of the screen as if he was watching me. His smile stretched out in a distorted way that almost made me want to throw the device away. I knew I was facing something beyond my imagination. That night, I tried to sleep, but a strange sound rang out. A buzzing sound came from the laptop speaker, even though I had turned it off. When I turned the screen back on, I saw that the video was playing not from the camera, but from a place I had never seen before. A dark room with scorched walls and a wooden chair in the middle. On the chair sat a figure with his head down. When he looked up, I was stunned because it was my own face, but it was gaunt like a corpse. I tried every way to delete the data, but couldn't. Every time I deleted the video, another one appeared. They moved irregularly. Sometimes it was a ghost walking around the kitchen. Sometimes it was me talking to something invisible. These images seemed to be purposely created to torment my mind. I started to hear giggling every time the video distorted, as if there were people on the other side of the screen mocking me. I felt like I was no longer the one controlling the camera. It was the camera controlling me. I was pulled into animated horror stories that I couldn't escape. One night, when I was so exhausted, I left my laptop open and closed my eyes. In my sleep, I heard footsteps walking around. When I opened my eyes, I saw the screen showing me sleeping exactly as I was now. But behind me, a series of dark figures stood in the room. I turned around, but it was empty. Only the video still showed the horrifying truth. I knew I had crossed the line between reality and fantasy. The videos were no longer just evidence. They were a door for the other side to enter my world, and I knew that I had only seen the beginning of much more terrifying animated horror stories waiting ahead. I had been used to living alone in this apartment for many years, but now the loneliness had become a torture. Being home alone used to be normal, but now it had turned into a nightmare. Every small sound echoed more clearly, making me feel like the whole apartment was filled with an invisible presence. Home alone was no longer quiet, but horror. That night, I turned off all my phones and sat in the living room with only a dim table lamp. I wanted to try to spend a night without checking the camera or looking at my laptop, but the silence made me suffocate. Around 2 a.m., I heard slow footsteps coming from the bedroom. I held my breath and listened. The sound got closer and closer until it stopped right in front of the living room door. I didn't dare to move. After a few minutes of silence, I gathered up my courage and walked to open the bedroom door. The room was dark and empty, but when I turned on the phone camera, I saw on the screen the shadow of a man standing in the middle of the room. He was not visible to me, but clearly visible through the lens. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I knew I would never be truly home alone again. The next day, I decided not to leave the apartment. I wanted to face it face to face. I locked all the doors and sat still on the sofa. The afternoon passed heavily, and as night fell, I prepared myself. Around 3 a.m., there was a knock on the door. I did not open it, but sat in silence. But the camera showed 3 charred figures standing in the hallway. They stared at my apartment door. I knew they were waiting for me to open it. I began to hear voices whispering in my head. A child's voice, a woman's voice, and a horseman's voice. They repeated my name over and over. I covered my ears, but the sound did not go away. I screamed in despair, but the apartment was still mine. Home alone now meant I was abandoned to the spirits. Another time, I tried to sleep in the living room. I pulled the covers over my head, but as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of chairs being dragged across the floor. When I opened my eyes, I saw all the chairs in the kitchen arranged in a circle. In the middle of the circle was a shadow. It slowly raised its head, revealing a gaunt, charred face. I jumped up and ran to the bedroom and locked the door, but a loud knocking sound immediately sounded at the door behind me. I realized that loneliness was not salvation, but a sentence. There was no one left to witness what I had gone through. The videos and evidence were all kept by me alone. I began to doubt my own mind, but my bruised body was proof of the truth. Sometimes I saw myself through the camera sitting in the living room, but I knew clearly that I was standing in the bedroom. The other version slowly turned its head, looked straight into the camera, and smiled. I was overwhelmed by the thought that maybe I was no longer myself. I was just one of many versions that these entities created to torment me. The apartment swallowed the silence. Whenever I tried to be quiet, a soft laugh would ring out. When I turned on the music, the distorted sound turned into a voice calling my name. I had nowhere to hide. Being home alone became the most terrifying situation of my life. I knew I was slowly falling apart. I had no strength to fight anymore, and no one believed me. The apartment became a prison with ghosts guarding it. I could only wait night after night, hoping that someone out there would understand. But deep down, I knew I was slowly becoming a part of the apartment. And when I did, I would no longer be the one recounting the stories of Home Alone, but would become a part of it forever. That night, the rain poured down heavily. The sound of rain hitting the roof and windows echoed throughout the apartment. I sat in the living room, looking out the window. At first, I felt relieved because rain usually helps me sleep. Rain sounds are comforting sounds, but in this case, it had a different meaning. The sound of rain covered many other sounds, making me wonder what was hidden in the darkness. Around 3 a.m., while listening to the rain, I began to notice something strange. In the background rustling sound, I heard vague whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. But the more I concentrated, the clearer I heard it. It wasn't the wind, but voices. Children's voices, women's voices, horsemen's voices, all mixed with the sound of rain to create an eerie melody. I shivered, feeling like someone was standing right behind me talking. I turned on the camera to check. On the screen, faint figures moved behind the glass window. They were drawn in the raindrops on the glass. When a flash of lightning flashed, I saw pale faces pressed against the door, staring in. I screamed and pulled the curtains, but the whispering didn't stop. It echoed throughout the apartment, drowning out the rain the next day. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination caused by fatigue. But when I played the recording I had set up that night, I heard it all clearly. A child's voice calling my name over and over again. A woman's voice whispering nonsense like a curse. I threw the recorder away, but I could still hear it in my head. The rain sounds were now a haunting memory that I couldn't erase. Another night, it rained again. I tried not to pay attention, but as I sat quietly, I heard a knock on the door, mixed with the sound of the rain. 3 distinct knocks repeated over and over again. I went closer, but when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I turned around and the camera screen showed a different scene. Outside the door, 3 charred figures stood in the rain. They raised their heads and looked straight into the camera. Their clothes were soaked, but the flames were still burning around their bodies. The sight made me shiver. The apartment no longer had any quiet sounds for me. Even the rain, which was supposed to be a peaceful sound, turned into a nightmare. I found myself trapped in a supernatural music where each raindrop contained the whispers of spirits. Every night when it rained, I felt them coming closer. I could clearly hear footsteps in the hallway mixed with the sound of dripping water. I saw the silhouette of a person standing right next to my bed reflected on the glass of the window. Once, when it was raining heavily, I fell asleep tiredly. In my dream, I saw myself walking in the rain. But instead of water, the raindrops falling were black ash. When I looked up, I saw the sky red with fire. Dozens of charred figures walked around me, muttering something. When I woke up, I could still hear the whispers in my ears, even though it was only a light rain outside. I understand that even dreams are no longer a safe place. The rain sounds have now become a soundtrack for the spirits. Every rainy night, I know for sure that I will hear them calling my name. I am scared, but I cannot stop. I understand that I have only scratched the surface of reality. This apartment has turned every familiar sound into a reminder that I no longer belong in the world of peace. I used to read a lot of creepypastas online on boring nights. The horror stories written by strangers always made me shiver, but then I closed my computer and slept soundly. I never thought that one day I would live in those lines. But now every night in this apartment is a living creepypasta, with me as the main character. One night I decided to search the forum to see if anyone had experienced the same thing. I typed in the keywords camera and ghost. A series of stories appeared. Some said their home camera recorded themselves entering the room even though they were sleeping elsewhere. Some said they saw ghosts appear in the mirror and call their names. Each line seemed to reflect the experience I was going through. I shivered when I realized I was no longer alone. But the terrible thing was that after reading those creepypastas, I went back to check the camera and saw the exact same scene. A shadowy figure stepped out of the bathroom mirror. It stood motionless, staring straight into the camera. I remembered reading the exact same story. It felt like the words I was reading were turning into a script for my life. The next day I tried not to go online. I was afraid that reading stories would make things worse. But my curiosity pulled me back. This time, I read about a person who hears whispers from his laptop speakers every night. As soon as the story ended, I heard a crackling sound coming from my own laptop. A distorted voice whispered my name. I was chilled to the realization that there was no longer a line between fiction and reality. The more creepypastas I read, the more they came to life in my apartment. One story said that the ghost would leave a charred handprint on the victim's pillow. That night, when I woke up, I found my pillow clearly marked with ash. I nearly went crazy, knowing that I had been caught in a vicious cycle. I tried to test it by reading another story, where the main character saw a double of himself smiling in the mirror. I finished reading and went to the bathroom. When I looked in the mirror, I was stunned to see my doppelganger smiling while I was completely still. It slowly raised its hand and waved goodbye. I panicked and smashed the mirror, but the image was still imprinted in each piece of glass. I began to think that the spirits in the apartment were using creepypasta as a way to communicate. They turned the internet legends into reality to torment me. Every night, I just waited to see which story would reappear. I had insomnia, and my body was exhausted. The apartment was no longer a place I lived, but a creepy website with each line coming true. One night, when it was pouring rain, I read a story about a man who saw a ghost sitting on his sofa. When I turned around, I clearly saw a dark figure sitting on the sofa in the living room. He slowly raised his head to reveal a burned face. The camera recorded everything. I understood that reading had turned me into a victim. I could no longer escape this game. The apartment was now a living book of creepypasta. I knew I was sinking deeper and deeper and would soon become one of those stories that others would read. But this time, it wouldn't be a fictional legend. It would be the creepy truth of my life. After weeks of exhaustion in the apartment, I decided to leave. I thought if I went far away, the entities wouldn't be able to follow me. I packed a tent, some food, and drove to the countryside to camp. I believed that nature and fresh air would help me find peace. But even on the road, I felt like I was being watched. The white eyes flashed in the rearview mirror, sending a chill down my spine. I arrived at a small, quiet forest a few hours outside the city. I set up my tent next to a stream, lit a fire, and tried to enjoy the sounds of nature. The sounds of insects, running water, and rustling wind made me feel better. I smiled for the first time in weeks. I told myself that maybe I was finally free of the haunting. But that peace only lasted until nightfall. As the sky darkened and a faint moon appeared, I began to hear strange noises coming from the forest. The sound of footsteps stepping on dry leaves, the sound of branches breaking. I thought it was just wild animals, so I took a flashlight to check. But when I shined it into the darkness, I saw nothing but a pair of sparkling eyes looming behind the trees. They disappeared as soon as I shone them directly. I returned to the campfire, my heart pounding. I sat still by the small fire, trying to calm myself. But when I looked at the phone screen, I was stunned. The mini camera I brought to record the camping scene had captured the image of a tall, thin figure standing right at the edge of my tent. He didn't move, just looked inside. When I turned around, there was no one. But the video was so clear. I knew I couldn't escape. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers from the wind. The whispers were similar to the voices I heard in the apartment. I trembled, realizing that those spirits had followed me out into the forest. The apartment was no longer their prison. They carried their hauntings everywhere. Around 3 a.m., the campfire was dying down. I sat in the dark, listening to every sound. Suddenly, I heard a giggle right next to my ear. I turned around in surprise, but there was no one. The camera captured a burnt little girl playing with ashes by the fire. She looked straight into the lens and laughed. I almost fainted from fear. When the sun rose, I quickly packed up to leave this place. But strangely, the road out of the forest seemed to disappear. I drove for hours and kept turning around the same bend. I realized I was trapped. The forest seemed to be surrounding me and holding me tight. I remembered the folk tales of the cursed forest, where anyone who set foot in would never escape. The next night I had to set up camp again and wait. I made a bigger fire, but the flickering fire did not provide safety. I heard the sound of dragging iron chains in the distance. Heavy footsteps approached. When I shined my flashlight, I saw the silhouette of a charred man, almost as tall as the treetops. His eyes were glowing and staring at me. When I blinked, he was gone. But the sound of chains continued throughout the night. I understood that camping was not an escape. No matter how far I went, those entities would follow me. I had no safe place. Nature could not protect me. The deep forest had become a new stage for the horrors to continue. I knew that this journey would be long, and I was only going deeper into the darkness. I used to think that only the apartment where I lived was haunted. But when I got lost in the woods, I realized that this haunting was not tied to a place. It followed me like a shadow and turned the whole forest into a haunted land. Every night here was a challenge that made me fall deeper into the abyss. When night fell, I sat by the campfire, listening to the wind whistling through the trees. The sound of the chain dragging that I had heard before rang out again. It was far away and getting closer. I turned on my flashlight but saw only dense darkness. The sound of the chain echoed around me as if something huge was lurking. I tried to reassure myself that as long as I kept the fire burning, I would be safe. But as soon as the fire went out, I saw a tall figure standing in the middle of the forest looking straight at me. His eyes were glowing in the dark. I ran into the tent and zipped it up, but heavy footsteps were circling around. I heard the sound of fingernails scratching the fabric. The sound of heavy breathing was right outside. I huddled under the blanket, my heart pounding. I didn't dare move all night. When dawn broke, I opened the tent, but all that remained were footprints in the damp ground. They were twice the size of a normal human foot and left a scorched trail. The next day, I tried to find my way out of the forest. But the more I walked, the more I felt like I was back at square one. The map on my phone lost signal. All the paths led back to the original campsite. I began to understand that this forest was no ordinary forest. It was haunted by something that wanted me trapped forever. The next night, I heard singing in the distance. A sad melody echoed through the night wind. I followed the sound and saw a woman sitting under a tree, singing softly. When I got closer, I saw her face cracked and covered in ash. She looked up at me and then disappeared in a puff of smoke. I shivered and realized that this was one of the spirits from the apartment that had followed me all the way here. The small camera I brought with me still worked. When I reviewed it, I saw scenes that the naked eye could not see. Dozens of white shadows moved between the trees. They stood in a circle around my tent every night. Sometimes a tall shadow leaned close to look into the lens. I knew clearly that this forest was full of lost souls. It was as haunted as the apartment I used to live in once. While walking along the stream, I saw ripples on the water, even though there was no wind. When I bent down, I was startled because the reflection was not my face, but a distorted, burned face. It laughed eerily and then disappeared into the water. I fell back on the ground, gasping for breath. It felt like the forest was mocking my weakness. I started to hear children's laughter echoing every night. When I turned back, I only saw the swaying shadows of the trees. But the camera clearly recorded the silhouette of a little girl sitting on a branch looking down at where I slept. Her white eyes glowed on the screen. I realized I could not escape them. Even the deep forest could not hide me from the haunting. I sat for hours thinking about my fate. I knew that the apartment was only the beginning. The spirits had chosen me as their host. Wherever I went, they made it haunted. I felt like prey being chased everywhere. I began to wonder if I would ever escape or if I would eventually disappear into their world. When night fell again, I saw the campfire spontaneously flaring up without me lighting it. Around the fire, a series of silhouettes appeared. They stood silently watching me. I felt like I was participating in an uninvited ritual. My legs were stiff, unable to run. I understood that this forest had swallowed me. It was haunted, and now I was just a part of its game. I used to wonder if everything I experienced was just a hallucination, a product of my exhausted mind. But when I started to hear stories from the locals, I understood that these were true stories passed down through generations. The apartment where I lived had been the scene of a fire, and the forest where I was trapped contained tragic deaths that few dared to mention. An old man living in a nearby village happened to meet me as I was making my way out. He looked at me with fear and asked if I had slept in the forest at night. When I nodded, he trembled slightly. He told me that many years ago, a group of people got lost in the forest and never returned. They only found a few burnt clothes with the smell of smoke. Since then, people believe that their souls still wander among the trees, turning the forest into a haunted land. This story coincided with what I saw through the camera. Burned figures, the sound of dragging chains, and lifeless eyes. I shuddered when I realized that I had accidentally set foot in their land. It wasn't my imagination, but I was reliving the memories of the dead. Those true stories replayed every night, making me an unwilling witness. That night, when I returned to the tent, I decided to turn on all the recording devices and cameras. I wanted clearer evidence. When I reviewed it the next morning, I saw a picture of a family of 3 sitting around a fire. They looked at each other silently, then turned to look straight into the camera. In the dim light, their faces showed burns and ash. I felt like they were trying to say that they were the victims of the past. Not only the forest, but also the apartment I used to live in had a bloody history. A friend who worked near the building sent me an old newspaper article. In it, it was written that many years ago, a large fire burned down the entire floor where my apartment lived. More than 10 people died, most of them suffocated by the smoke and fire. The attached photo showed familiar faces. I was stunned to realize that they were exactly like the spirits I had seen on camera. All the phenomena I experienced were rooted in real tragedies. Those spirits were not products of imagination. They existed because their deaths were never acknowledged or laid to rest. I was like the only one chosen to see and hear their stories. One rainy night, I sat in my tent, listening to the sound of rain mixed with whispers. I clearly heard a voice calling for help. It repeated the words, "Get us out of here." I shuddered to realize that the spirits did not want to harm me. They wanted me to be the bridge to tell their story. But carrying this truth meant I had to live with it forever. When I thought about those true stories, I realized that I was tied to fate. I was no longer just a living person. I am the keeper of memories for the forgotten souls. Wherever I go, they follow me, a reminder that the truth never goes away. And I know full well that these stories will continue to haunt me until I become a part of them. I used to think that the spirits around me only wanted to tell the story of their deaths. But the more I observed, the more I realized that their presence had another purpose. It was revenge. Revenge stories do not only exist in legends. I was living in a chapter of their story, filled with blood and dust. That night, sitting in the tent, I heard the fierce wind howling. Amidst the sound of rain and rustling leaves, I heard a clear voice. It whispered incessantly about betrayal and death. Those voices were filled with hatred. I understood that their spirits could not rest in peace because they wanted justice, and I was the only one forced to witness it. The camera recorded a horrifying scene. In the frame appeared a family of 3 sitting in the middle of a circle of fire. Their eyes were no longer pleading like before, but full of resentment. The charred man raised his hand and pointed at me. The image immediately faded and my face appeared clearly on the screen. I was stunned to realize that they didn't just want to tell the truth. They wanted me to pay for what they had lost. I remembered the article about the fire in my old apartment. There were suspicions that the fire was not an accident. Someone had deliberately blocked the exit to keep them inside. But the culprit was never found. Maybe that was the reason they still existed. And now they saw me as a link to continue the story of revenge. The next night, I heard footsteps around the tent. When I opened my phone screen, I saw dozens of figures approaching. They stood in a tight circle around them. All their eyes were shining. They didn't say anything, but I could clearly feel the hatred filling me. I cowered in fear. I knew I wasn't the one who caused their deaths, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that I was here, and I was the target of revenge. Another time, I dreamed that I was locked in a burning apartment. The thick smoke choked me. When I tried to escape, I saw a series of figures blocking the door. They looked at me with cold eyes and whispered that I had to pay. When I woke up, my clothes were covered in the smell of smoke. There were small burns on my hands. I could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. I began to understand that these revenge stories had no end. They would continue until someone took the blame for the evildoers of the past. And I was the chosen one. This feeling made me more desperate than death, because even if I ran away, I would still carry resentment. The next night, it rained heavily. The campfire went out. I sat in the dark, listening to the sound of dragging chains. From the deep forest appeared a giant black shadow. He did not hurry, but walked slowly towards me. Every time he advanced, I heard dozens of voices ringing out at the same time, all combined into a chorus of hatred. I collapsed because I knew I could not resist. I understand that from now on, I am no longer simply a witness. I am a part of their revenge story. And as long as the fire of hatred is not extinguished, I will forever be bound. The revenge stories will continue to be written until my soul is also swallowed by the storm of hatred. I have lived in this obsession for too long. The apartment, the forest, everywhere I go is filled with inexplicable phenomena. Tonight, sitting in the dark room, I feel like this will be the last night. There is no more ambiguity. The scary phenomena have exceeded the limits of human endurance. Around 3 a.m., all the lights in the room went out at the same time. The camera flashed and then a series of shadows appeared around me. I saw myself on the screen, but that version was no longer me. His face was burned, his eyes were white and his smile was wide. He looked into the lens and slowly walked out of the frame. I turned around and saw him standing right behind me. I ran into the hallway, but the door did not open. The hallway was dark. Only the sound of footsteps echoed. Countless hands imprinted with ash appeared on the wall. Each hand scratched hard, leaving a black burn mark. I ran, but the path stretched on endlessly. No matter how far I went, I always returned to the starting point. I knew I was trapped in a loop with no way out. In the apartment, everything was distorted. The chair and table were spinning. The windows were shaking. Black hands were rising from the floor, trying to pull me down. I struggled, but there were more and more of them. Crying, laughing, screaming echoed everywhere. I was surrounded by chaotic sounds. Each sound seemed to tear my mind apart. In that moment, I remembered everything I had ever experienced. The shadow on the camera, the burnt girl, the ash woman, the sound of chains dragging in the forest, the lifeless eyes in the hallway. All of them appeared at once. They were no longer hidden, but filled the apartment. I was drowning in a sea of souls. I knelt in the middle of the room, my whole body trembling. I knew I had no way to escape. I myself was now only a part of this story. I was no longer the John of the past. I am a witness, a victim, and also a ghost in the cursed apartment. The camera recorded the last moment. On the screen, I sat motionless. My eyes were white and my smile was distorted. Around me were dozens of charred figures standing silently. Fire from somewhere erupted, engulfing the frame. The video ended in absolute darkness. No one knows what happened after that. But there are rumors that the apartment still exists. People say that every time someone installs a camera in the apartment, they see the image of a man sitting motionless, his eyes staring blankly at the screen. They believe that it is me. The story ends here. But for me, it has only just begun. Because in the darkness, there are still scary phenomena waiting for the next person to step into. And when the door opens, there will be another person who will become the next part of this endless nightmare chain.